great thing about the Britfunk records, they just didn't sound like any other record that had been made at that point.
Black records could be made in this country, and you didn't necessarily have to be black.
The chant has begun. You're going to sit.
It was just part of the progression of British pop, and that in itself makes it important.
It's why we're here today, still talking about, because we had all the other guys with us, and it's like a family, to tell the truth, in terms of what we have given to the music business from here, dance feel, and the history of Britfunk.
In the 70s and early 80s, as jazz-funk music laid claim to the discotheques and nightclubs of Britain, a collective chant echoed around the dance floors. This was the voice of a new generation, signalling the start of a small cultural revolution.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. It was definitely a sound of young people influenced by the jazz funk clubs.
I think it was about stamping our own identity on the music industry with all our influences.
The scene was born from a club philosophy unique to these shores, our very own jazz funk Britannia.
And it was nice that this homegrown music was actually getting played on the radio.
With a nod to American funk and soul artists and embracing the spirit of club culture, a fresh wave of UK bands would inspire a new phrase.
We had to come up with this idea, a marketing idea. That's exactly what it was.
Bless the funk. Hi, I'm David Grant, and this is the Britfunk story. This is me and my group Lynx, way back in September 1980, enjoying our first chart success with the song You're Lying. We went on to have an album in the top 10 and were the first British black band to be on the front cover of the New Musical Express. We played an important role in educating record companies in how to manage and promote black artists. When I look back on those days, the music we made represented a snapshot of the lives of a lot of young people. The early 80s was a highly political period, and the British music scene, as always, reflected the mood of the time.
Funk was, and dance music was cool.
Vocalist Ingrid Mansfield-Allman.
There was this big underground soul movement. My sister was a soul girl, my other sister was a reggae girl, and our parents are very different. They'd come over here and they were expected to keep their heads down and know their places, and our generation was more like, no, we're here and this is what we're saying, and a bit more out and proud about it. I think what happened was a lot of the people who were involved in the British jazz funk scene were kids of people who were jazz musicians.
Jazz music has its roots in the fertile soil of the American South in the latter part of the 19th century, where newly liberated slaves induced a rhythmic tradition that harked back to their African forefathers. From blues to swing, trad to bebop, the music continued to evolve, and in the 1970s, jazz finally plugged in. A new blend of jazz rock manifested itself. Some called it fusion, others called it crossover, but the musical landscape was changing, and it was time for jazz to get funky.
So by the kind of the mid-70s, jazz is immensely popular again with a young crowd.
DJ Mark Cotgrove, alias Snowboy.
It's influenced in disco and soul and funk now. In America, they were massive selling stuff, but it wasn't actually that popular in the discos. It was the discos in the UK where it really taken to. You know, you got Lonnie Liston Smith, Expansions and Brass Construction, Roy Ayers. I mean, Roy Ayers had never seen anything like it in the UK. As massive as he was in America with in concerts and stuff like that. Couldn't believe it when he'd come over and play at a jazz funk all day.
Most of the big names in the world of jazz funk were American. However, some British artists were steadily gaining recognition, notably the Average White Band from Scotland and London-based groups Heatwave and the Olympic Runners. Successful 70s soul group The Real Thing were also feeling the force. In the mid-70s, Gonzales, heard here, were developing a unique British funk sound. However, it was the arrival of a boy band from North London that became the catalyst for a new movement.
We were like listening to Roy Ayers, the Crusaders, Herbie Hancock.
Guitarist and vocalist with High Tension, Paul P.
We were very influenced by Earth, Wind & Fire. And then because of our background being from the Caribbean, knowing reggae music, knowing ska and all those influences, and then the British thing, because the British sound is slightly different from the Americans. Americans are more polished. We're kind of rough, raw and ready, and that's what we came with.
To this day, I never underestimate the importance of High Tension. When they took this song into the charts in 1978, they showed what could be done by a British act.
I don't think another band in another country outside of the US could have made a record like that. That was the music they were hearing in the clubs. High Tension were a product of the British jazz funk scene, definitely the first.
Around this time, I was working with my cousin in a record shop which imported soul records from America. We were the first ones to import Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life, and my cousin also managed a band who would rehearse in the back of the shop at night. I could hear firsthand the sounds of a group heavily influenced by American jazz funk music, but performing with a raw style and British twist to their instrumentation and vocals. The band's name? Light of the World.
When I first signed Light of the World on the first album, I had an American producer do it, Vinnie Castellano.
Legendary DJ Chris Hill is a major influence in British music.
He just was absolutely spellbound by it. I think he'd been the drummer in the Four Seasons band. You know, he had quite a broad spectrum of knowledge. We flew him over and he just went nuts. And he kept doing this thing about, you know what you got here? You got the Black Beatles. You got the Black Beatles here. We said, we haven't. He thought it was so different. He said, yeah, but the way in America the Beatles sounded so different. He said nobody would have ever made a record like that. At that time, it was still difficult to get a black act on daytime radio.
I knew that Britfunk had arrived, really.
Vocalist and percussionist with Light of the World, G. Bello.
If you're young, you're looking to do something fresh, and that was the fresh sound. And also, the music was quite fast. When you're young, you like fast music, you like the beats to be fast. And there was also a dance craze with Britfunk stroke jazz funk music, was people that did jazz dancing. And that had to be certain tempos, had to have certain flavours in there, certain breaks within the music. Jazz funk dancing was the thing of the day.
Without dancing, there would have been no British jazz funk era. The scene developed from the home counties, particularly in Essex, in clubs such as the Goldmine and Lacy Lady, and also London clubs such as Crackers. In the south, DJ Chris Hill and an influential group of disc jockeys collectively known as the Funk Mafia were leading the way. In the north, Colin Curtis and Mike Shaft, among others, were also instrumental in its popularity.
The scene in the home counties, really, you had to see it to believe it at that point.
Snowboy is a DJ, percussionist, music promoter and author of the book From Jazz Funk and Fusion to Acid Jazz, a history of the jazz dance scene.
The DJs had really pushed the envelope so much with what was acceptable on the dance floor. It seemed like the heavier the DJs played, the more the dancers responded, and the more the dancers responded, the more the DJs got more and more adventurous. This is why you got heavier and heavier jazz starting to get played. Actual jazz fusion really, and much more the samba orientated stuff. And the jazz funk got very, very heavy. Jazz funk, jazz fusion. There wasn't really much difference between it, really, in tempo wise or intensity, you know. And it all just felt very, very natural next to disco, next to Philly soul. And of course, the more trickier the rhythms and the faster it was, that brought out the better dancers, and there's going to be a competitive edge on the floor and dance battles happening.
Level 42's Mark King.
There were just so many places that they were having all-dayers and all-nighters and weekenders. You know, it was pretty wild times, really.
Different areas played different music. And here in Manchester, I played a specific type of funk and soul. Radio presenter Mike Shaft. All the stuff from the States was what was happening in Manchester at that time. And then, of course, as the youngsters in this country heard this stuff, they then began to make their own versions of it. As the music became popular, more and more British 12-inch singles started to appear, fueling the craze for white labels.
White labels suddenly started to appear, and it was becoming quite apparent by reading James Hamilton's very, very influential column in Record Mirror. Self-financed, short-run 12-inch singles. At the time, it felt exciting and very underground.
Well, there was one time your whole box of 12s could be white labels where you'd have to write all the bloody titles on everything. And it was a way of getting this stuff round to the handful of shops, certainly in the London area, that were taking it. They wanted white labels. They didn't want finished product. They wanted to be able to turn around to DJs and go, I've just got this in, look, it's brand new, it's got nothing, who is it? God knows. They knew who they were because that's certainly how Link's first record came out.
I seem to remember that the first one was called Can You Feel It by Stop, and I remember the massive buzz on that. It just seemed that every week the new 12-inch singles suddenly started to appear, and it was not quite as good as the American jazz funk records, but we loved them because they were ours, and it was exciting because they were on a white label. When Level 42 came out with this white label called Sandstorm, within a day or two, everyone was talking about this band Level 42 and this record Sandstorm. It was heavy, heavy jazz funk, and it didn't sound like a derivative of American jazz funk. It was a new sound.
And we sort of came in on it, on the coattails of all these guys that had done all the work. I noticed that from November the 18th in 1980, that issue of Sounds, which was a music paper from the time, it's a little clip in, it just says Level 42, a US jazz funk outfit. The newspapers were assuming that we were American. I think the path that was set for us was really of the influences that we'd had, huge fans of the American jazz fusion scene. And then by the time we got through the mid-70s, and James Brown was the godfather of soul, and that whole funk element and Earth, Wind and Fire and that big crossover, that was what appealed to us as musicians. So the idea of being a part of a British version of it, that wasn't anything that we consciously thought of. We were just playing the music we liked to do. Our first producer, Andy Soiker, he was the one that came down and heard what we were playing. He had a band called Atmosphere, and they sort of had an instrumental hit in 1979. You could have instrumental hits back in these days, by the way. This is why I think that we managed to get a look in, and along with bands like Shack Attack.
In the early days, the first few albums, I mean, particularly the first album, Driving Hard, was pretty much all instrumental.
Shack Attack composer and pianist Bill Sharp.
We had a song called Brazilian Dawn, which was very much a sort of Latin workout for the band, lots of long solos and stuff. And I mean, it's amazing to think back in the early 80s that it was on the playlist at Radio 1, which just wouldn't happen these days.
I didn't start out the front with the band. I was sort of it was a gradual process.
Shack Attack vocalist Jill Sayward.
And when I did go up to sing in front, it wasn't as a soul singer. It was kind of a different style. A stage on from the type of backing vocals that I did, which were very straight, very white, I would say. And I guess it was unusual to see a white girl fronting a Britfunk band, and yeah, it was kind of unusual. We did get a lot of criticism for that, though, I have to say. A lot of slagging off because we were very straight and very girly sometimes, but we're still here.
With a fleeting smile below the lazy eyes, and the face that's not attempting to disguise.
We used to go around the country playing all sorts of weird places, and they'd always be rammed full of people, so there was a real movement and following for this kind of Britfunk thing.
But yeah, we always came across the same DJs when we turn up for these all-dayers. The same crew would be there and not the same crowd. It was definitely a community of bands, and we always met the same people. Oh, hi, Level 42 again,
The competition.
Yeah, it was competition. So, yeah.
In a good way.
The DJs were like pop stars to us. They represented this scene that we loved. This is why we all got behind the Brit Jazz Funk records when they started coming out, because that was all part of the scene that we loved.
It sort of encapsulated all the bands at the time, and they were part of the Britfunk movement, you know. It just gave them a hook. That's how we sell records in this country when we had record shops. They had to be able to go into a record shop and say, "Oi, mate, we got any Britfunk?"
Well, Britfunk was a marketing term. You know, they wanted, the record companies wanted people to feel that there was something happening in this country. And there was, but it was never as big as it was made out to be. It was very much a London phenomenon. That's one of the first things I would say. And in the rest of the country, we picked out tracks and played the best of it.
It was purely, we sat in a room with the band, one of the bands, and said, "What can we call this?" Don't just put a record out. Just before, I think people were calling it the sound of underground London, and then it was like, yeah, but there's people outside London would buy this stuff. But I know we came out of that meeting with the word.
Obviously, as it became more successful, then you get a lot of bands beginning to be labelled Britfunk, which actually were nowhere near Britfunk.
During the success of the jazz and Britfunk period, chanting materialised in the discotheques and nightclubs. This football crowd-style interaction with the music and DJ also became commonplace at jazz-funk concerts.
On basic human terms, it's a very natural thing to do, you know, call and answer.
It was all like, whoa, 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 whoa.
Chris Hill again.
I got two of them. I shouldn't admit to this, but I got two of them from Oh, What a Lovely War. And there was things like, we're here because we're here because we're here. You could actually use those. Once you started banging away at it, you'd have them all singing it, you know.
There was no barrier between Chris and the audience as far as he saw, even though we all looked up to him. He liked this interaction, and he realised the power of that at the All Dayers and at Caister. He could basically make people do whatever he wanted, you know. He was so in charge.
When you're playing to a crowd, you want that feedback coming back. And you can't beat when someone's, you know, you give them a line and they hit you back with that line. You can't beat that. You can't beat that feeling.
Bless the funk.
We had the hook line of Bless the Funk, which was great.
The origins of chanting go back to the early days of R&B.
G. Bellow's Light of the World was the centrepiece from which other associated musical projects formed, including groups such as Incognito and Beggar & Co.
Horn sections particularly used to respond to a call. You got bands like Cameo, and they had a chant where they just go, hey, 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 hey.
We did have a chant.
Level 42's Mark King helped popularise the style of slap bass guitar.
When we did the whole day-o, day-a, ba-down, day-o, day-a, ba-da, it was amazing how the audience would sing it back to you. Then that would sort of get like chopped down a bit, so they'd just be going whoa, 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 and you know, I'll still go on stage now, and the sort of the diehards start sort of kicking off with that thing. Great days. But the chant, yeah, I think it's just a way of unifying. It's a way that an audience get involved.
We even felt the chant, and in the name of authenticity, got a group of clubbers to come into the studio and chant on the second Link single, Rise and Shine.
And there were some obvious ones, and we took them and put them on records. On the Beggar and Company, whoa, whoa, whoa.
And that was seeing chart recognition for that. Quite weird to see it.
With support from the club disc jockeys and labels such as Ensign, Chrysalis and Elite, artists including myself, Light of the World, Level 42, Central Line and Shack Attack were enjoying plenty of chart success, rubbing shoulders with the new romantics and punk groups on Top of the Pops.
Going on Top of the Pops, that was absolutely surreal. It was mind-blowing. It's like you're in this fantastic building, you're seeing all the things that you see every week, and then you're seeing all these stars, all these people that are well known to us, like we met Blondie, people like that, and it's like, my God, we're here, you know?
Yeah, the fashion's changed quite a lot. I was always conscious of having to do something different, and it was vitally important to me to create some sort of image each time. And I used to be so self-conscious that if I wore the wrong thing, if the record went down, I just think, oh God, no, you do as a woman. You felt responsible. You thought, oh, perhaps it wasn't the right thing.
Top of the Pops was such an important show to get on, and we looked like mates who just sort of got together down the pub. I had white leather trousers on and a stripy shirt, and Phil had a jumpsuit on, and I don't know, a onesie or whatever the hell they call it these days. And it was Mike had a big afro and a huge moustache. He looked like some Mexican bandit. And Leroy Williams was on there with us too. And the thing I remember most of all is that we couldn't take our eyes off the monitors, because there used to be TV monitors hanging from the ceilings. And we'd never been on telly before. So all we're doing is just, all of us are looking at these different monitors going, hey, look, I'm on telly. It's quite sad, isn't it?
In those days, when you were on Top of the Pops, you felt like you'd arrived. You'd stand on stage, and on another stage would be Thin Lizzy, on another stage might be the Police, on another stage might be the Jam, and you thought, I'm rubbing shoulders with pop royalty here. I must be in.
One of the reasons I became really good friends with Ian Dury was because of the appearance on Top of the Pops singing Southern Freeze.
Ingrid Mansfield-Allman again.
I was very surprised to find out that he was really into Thelonious Monk and Ella Fitzgerald and Don Cherry, and he had a really, really amazing musical taste. So we kind of found a common ground because of that.
Nothing sounded like Southern Freeze when that came out, and I know they'd already had a record or two out before then, but this whole brand new sound and the sensation that created was just beyond belief.
When I saw you on the floor doing the Southern Freeze,
I didn't really want to look like a sex object. I wanted to make sure that it was about my singing.
for me, love.
My dad told me off for not dancing, but the truth of the matter is that I had a 3-inch splinter in the sole of my foot, and so I couldn't dance if I would have wanted to, in contrast to the rest of the band who were jumping around like jumping beans.
Being successful, went on Top of the Pops and was hanging around and waiting for our spot to come up, and we did our rehearsal, and when we came off, I remember Gary Kemp from Spandau Ballet. He came up and he said, I think your band's great. How do you think about doing a collaboration? And I was like, I thought, wow, great. Yeah, I'm sure we could. That would be fantastic to do. Thanks for asking. We'll change numbers. As we're changing numbers, the guy from Dexys Midnight Runners came up. I think his name Kevin Rowland. And he pulled me to one side and said, hey, are you talking to them? I said to Kevin, what do you think we should do? So he said, I think you should work with us. I said, why? So he said, because you'll be better off with us. And I thought to myself, I looked down at him. He's dressed there, right, in denim dungarees, no shirt underneath, a necktie, a flat hat, right, and sort of open-toe shoes. And I looked round at the Spandau Ballet people, right, and they were dressed from head to foot in, like, Gucci clothes, right, really slick, really nice, right, and I just went, nah, I don't think so.
It was us saying, right, let's go back and be honest about our roots. We do like funk music.
Gary Kemp of Spandau Ballet talking in 1988.
Also, I quite like the idea of admitting that, because the national music papers had always been very derogatory about funk music because it was a very working class music, and rock had always been the middle class students scene. And Chant number 1 kind of summed that state of the art in a way.
When I first went to the Goldmine, I was aware that it was a predominantly white audience, but what really struck me was that people were listening to and embracing black music, and therefore didn't have a problem welcoming black people. And eventually the scene became so racially and culturally integrated that it gave me an idea and a vision of what music did, of what passion did when people shared a passion. Barriers of race, barriers of gender, and barriers of class were broken down, and we all mixed together loving the same thing, and that same thing was music.
there are lots of mixed race, mixed culture children around today who began their lives in the clubs in Manchester that I was playing at.
It was nice to be able to be in a position where you could help those bands, and sign them up and give them a record deal. That's really, the thing I enjoy the most, thinking back, that and the whole way that this country just gelled. As a commercial venture, it just helped it along a bit. It was like, you can't just make these records and leave them out floundering out there. We've got to put a hook on it. And that's what made it work.
Whichever way you look at it, not every country in the world has been able to do that. So there was something curious about the Brit aspect of it. So to have been part of a small part in that great machine is fantastic. Yeah, I'm proud of that.
Veteran DJ Mark Webster describes Britfunk as raw and up-tempo. What it lacks in the smooth finesse of the polished American jazz funk, it makes up for with unbridled enthusiasm and energy. But by the mid-80s, as dance music progressed using new electronic sounds and rap, that energy wasn't enough to stop a sharp decline in its popularity. Some artists survived, but it seemed Britfunk had run its course.
I think what's interesting in 2013 is that we are in the middle of a jazz funk revival, countrywide jazz funk revival. There's jazz funk reunions going on all over the place, and it's very much people that were there in the day, so it would be great to put on, say, Atmosphere Dancing in Outer Space, and you can say on the mic, do you remember the first time you ever heard this record? And you will get cheers from the audience, because people do remember it's the first time they heard that record. They could probably name the club. They might even be able to remember the month where they first heard it. So, and that's the passion of the audience.
So many people were responsible for the creation, promotion and popularisation of Britfunk that it would be impossible to name them all. But to every DJ, musician, producer and tribe member, this is a chant out to you. In the words of High Tension, bless the funk.
Feel the Chant, the Britfunk story, was presented by David Grant and produced in Salford by Stephen Garner.